Okay, well, thank you for the questions, everybody. We start with a question from somebody whose name I can't pronounce. It says, if free will doesn't exist, then does it mean that nobody should be punished or encouraged for their actions? So I think this is only an issue from the point of view of a retributive theory of punishment. So the idea would be that there are certain actions, certain crimes, such that the person who commits those crimes deserves to be punished, and the rest of society has some moral obligation to impose that punishment upon them. People are responsible for their actions, and if you do certain bad things to others, then maybe you deserve to have suffering imposed upon you. That sort of perspective, right? Now, from that point of view, it seems like it's going to be an issue whether or not people actually have control, whether people are freely choosing what they do. The thing is that I don't find retributive approaches to punishment even remotely appealing, regardless of whether or not there's free will. So even if people are freely in control of their actions, I just have like, let's say somebody freely chooses to murder someone, I don't feel any desire to make the murderer suffer. At least not for its own sake, right? Now, of course, there are other justifications for punishment. So you might say, well, we need to punish people who commit murder because we don't want to live in a world in which people commit murder. And by having some sort of legal system that imposes a penalty on those who commit murder, this will reduce murder rates, right? So that kind, it's deterrence, right? You want to have some sort of deterrent in place so that people are discouraged from committing murder. It doesn't matter whether people have free will from that point of view, right? So I think that we can come up with justifications for punishment that don't rest on free will. So, yeah, I think if free will doesn't exist, then no, it doesn't follow that nobody should be punished. It would depend on what the justification for punishment is. If the justification for punishment is entirely retributive, then the non-existence of free will would seem to pose a problem, but there are many other justifications for punishment. AE asks, what keeps you getting out of bed in the morning? Well, absolutely, what keeps you getting out? Yeah, absolutely nothing keeps me getting out of the bed in the morning, because I don't get out of bed in the morning, at least very rarely. There are special circumstances where I might have to get out of bed in the morning, but in my normal daily life, my usual sleep pattern would be I go to sleep at about 6 or 7 a.m. and then I'll sleep till 3 p.m., maybe 2 p.m., 3 p.m. So yeah, I usually don't get out of bed in the morning, and everything I do, with all my work and stuff, is such that I'm I'm able to work around that schedule. So it's very nice. But there are circumstances where where you just have to, and then I suppose the question of what keeps me getting out of bed in the morning would depend on what exactly is going on in those circumstances. For instance, when I was a kid, what kept me getting out of bed in the morning is that my parents kept waking me up and forcing me to go to school. So, depends. Analytic philosophy. What are your opinions on gender abolitionism? I think that if we're talking about this in terms of the sort of normative expectations associated with each gender, then I'm very much in favour of that. So, if it's okay, if we're talking about like the idea that men ought to behave in a particular way, women ought to behave in this particular way, and then there's going to be some sort of negative consequences for people who act outside those norms. So, like, if we're saying, well, men ought to be masculine, men ought not to wear dresses, and then there's some negative consequence for men who do wear dresses. That's a problem. I don't like that. I'm very much in favour of rebelling against those sorts of gender norms. So that would be, I suppose, a fairly weak sense of gender abolitionism. But I mean, so usually, as I understand it, the term gender abolitionism refers to something a bit more radical, which is well, the abolition of the gender categories, period. So I find it, I don't, I struggle to see how this could work. And the reason for this is that it seems like, gender is in some sense the sort of, how should I put it, social manifestation of certain biological distinctions. So we have like a biological distinction, right? And of course this, the biological distinction between males and females, and that distinction, it's not perfect, right? Some people have XX chromosomes, some people have XY chromosomes, but then you do get intersex people. But the vast majority of people are going to have XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, and then from that you get people who, some of them produce large gametes, some of them produce small gametes, right? Some of them have vaginas, some of them have penises. So we have these biological distinctions. And then it seems to me that what's going on with gender is, in some sense, right, those biological distinctions end up taking on a social importance. And then that's where this idea of like, gender in gender roles kind of comes from. Now, I really struggle to see how we could eliminate that or prevent that from happening. And, at least putting aside like transhumanism. I mean, obviously, so, okay, if we end up like uploading our minds to computers or something like that, then yeah, this, gender could probably quite easily be eliminated. Sex would be easily eliminated. But as long as we're sort of dealing with ordinary human bodies, it's hard to see how like the sex distinction could fail to have social consequences. So, I mean, okay, if we think about the fact that, for instance, reproduction is extremely significant to us, right? Having children is extremely significant to us. When I say us, I mean society in general. I'm sure some people don't care about that. I don't really care about that. It's of no interest to me. But for most people, right, reproduction, having kids, that's really important. And it's the females who have kids. It's females who get pregnant. So like, there's a kind of a very important biological feature, there's a biological feature which is of very great social significance. And so for that reason, it's like, it's hard for me to see like how we're gonna, like, why we would stop making gender distinctions. Maybe it's worth comparing this to something like race, right? I feel like in the case of race, we really could live without race. So it might take a while to get there, but, there's no particular, like, in the case of race, we're just talking about skin color, and skin color doesn't matter. Skin color it doesn't have to be of any social significance. The social grouping of people in terms of their skin color or in terms of their ethnicity could become as relevant to us as, the social grouping of people in terms of their hair color, or the social grouping of people in terms of their blood type. Like, there are probably going to be specific contexts where, race might still make a difference. So maybe in certain, medical contexts, it might well be that we find that particular populations have certain, genetics such that there are medications that don't work for them or something like that, right? So similarly with something like blood type, right? There are medical contexts where that matters, but like in your just everyday life, it doesn't matter what your blood type is, and I can easily envisage a society where it just doesn't matter what your skin color is or what your ethnicity is. It's much more tricky, I think, to imagine what a society would look like where we're not placing any sort of social significance upon these biological distinctions, like the fact that it's females who bear children, who get pregnant. So for that reason, it's sort of hard for me to envisage what gender abolition in the more radical sense would look like. So I suppose that's my thought on that. And I will now move on to your next question. Okay then, I heard you say that abortion is permissible because of bodily autonomy. But let's say a woman used an artificial womb, would you still be fine with a woman killing the fetus at like 15 weeks? Um, I, 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 I don't care. Okay, fine, kill it at 15 weeks. Ultimately, there are two things going on in my position with respect to abortion. So first of all, I think that because of the point about bodily autonomy, I think it's fine to just kill something that's in your body. And it doesn't matter what features that thing has. I could have a little Einstein in my body. So I could have like some brilliant, really intelligent scientist who's going to, cure cancer or something, or make really important discoveries in physics. If it's inside my body, I get to kill it, right? So that's my position. You can kill stuff that's in your body, and it doesn't matter what sorts of features it has. Um, so that's one point. But then there's another point, which is, well, I also happen to agree with the more standard line that you hear from pro-choice people, which is, well, that it just doesn't seem like it really kind of matters what you do with a fetus anyway, at least in the earlier stages of the pregnancy. So, I mean, of course, I can totally understand why, okay, if you look at something at, 30 weeks or whatever, then this is like, it's a baby. It has the same sorts of features that a newborn would have. So insofar as we object to killing newborns, we should object to killing that. When you get back to 15 weeks, I mean, it's not really so clear, right? It's not really. I mean, obviously, there's a gradual change. There's no strict line, but I think the thing is that at 15 weeks, you are at the point where you're not going to survive outside the womb, at least not without amazing kind of medical technology to intervene. And I think that probably if you don't buy into the sort of more extreme kind of bodily autonomy line that I do, then I think the sort of most plausible view of abortion would just be to say, well, it's all right up to the point where something can survive outside the womb without technological intervention. So something could survive outside the womb, in any society that you put it in. So, with that said, I mean, I just don't have strong feelings about an organism that is identical to a fetus at 15 weeks, and therefore I guess I'm still fine with it being killed, even in an artificial womb. Do you think we should punish criminals because they deserve it, or punish them because it will deter people from committing crimes? I guess I've already answered this. See my answer to the first question. If you had a gun to your head and had to choose between idealism or panpsychism, which would you choose? Well, panpsychism, in the sense that I think you mean it here. I mean, there's a broad sense of panpsychism where idealism just would be a kind of panpsychism. But I think the sense you mean it here is that panpsychism is like physicalism plus. It's like bog standard physicalism, okay, but plus we'll just add this like weird consciousness thing at a fundamental level, right? So I think that view is very unappealing. I think I would go with idealism because I have problems with physicalism anyway. So I mean, it feels to me like panpsychism is just sort of taking those problems and then adding more in a sense. I mean, there's just something a bit more aesthetically appealing about the simplicity of idealism. So I'd probably go with that one if I had a gun to the head. Anonymous Eliza, is the consumption of many insects for their protein more or less ethical than the consumption of beef, pork, chicken, etc.? Yeah, I think probably. I guess my intuitions would go in that direction. Well, well, there's two things here, right? I mean, there's a point about animal welfare and suffering and so on, and then and on that point, I mean, ultimately, I just feel like I have much more in common with the cows and pigs and chickens than I do with the insects. So it's easier to empathise with them, and it's not clear to me that insects suffer in the same way or to the same extent. Actually, it's plausible. I just don't know, right? Like, it could well be that insects experience very extreme states of suffering, but suffering isn't the only thing that matters. So, at least not to me. It's also going to matter, whether or not. I think that ultimately there's no getting away from the fact that, like, my sort of my feelings, like, ultimately, right, my moral judgments are going to be based on my feelings, and I just find it easier to empathize. Like, I feel like I can get my head into the space of, like, a cow or a pig or a chicken more easily than I can an insect. And it seems like, cows and pigs and chickens, um, they have they have sort of maybe interactions with others, or they have personal connections in ways that insects don't seem to, at least as I understand it. I mean, I could be wrong about this. I don't, look, I've never like lived with an insect, but insects seem much more simple. So it may well be that insects, suffer just as severely, but because they don't have such deep personal connections, because they don't have personalities, at least not in a way that I can as easily detect as I can for a cow or a pig or a chicken, I care about them less. So that's one point. That's the point about the treatment of the animals. I would rather, if we're going to be, killing and eating anything, I would rather it be insects than these other animals. But there's also the environmental impact, and my understanding of this is that um, it's it's far better in terms of resource usage, in terms of things like release of methane gases and so on. Like, if we were to transition from animal agriculture as it's currently practiced to eating primarily insects, that would be a much more it would be much more efficient, I think. So if you look at the amount of say grain that you have to feed a cow, so let's say it's I don't know, 10x, right? I don't know what the units are. Let's say you take 10x of grain, and then you feed that to a cow. Then that cow, might what you get from that cow might then feed one person. In the case of insects, you only need like 1x of the grain to feed one person. God, I should have said kilograms or something. This is the problem with talking off the top of my head. It's my God, why did I say it like that? That was such a ridiculous way to put the point. But hopefully you can see the point. I believe that that is true. I think that it requires fewer resources to feed the same amount of people if you're using insects versus if you're using cows, pigs, chickens, and so on. All right then. Bilbo Swaggins, do you think the divide between continental and analytic philosophy is a real thing, or is it something based entirely on vibes? I don't really know why the idea that it's based entirely on vibes would mean that it's not a real thing. I mean, it seems to me that many of the many social distinctions, many distinctions in traditions are quite plausibly said to be based on vibes, but that may still have quite significant consequences. I mean, there is a distinction between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. They are distinct social groupings. Certainly, there is a distinction in style. I mean, if one reads contemporary analytic philosophy or contemporary versus contemporary continental philosophy, you can see that people are sort of writing and presenting their arguments in very different ways. Now, I mean, do you want to say that that's vibes? I don't know. It seems significant to me. Like, it makes a difference with respect to things like comprehensibility. So for me, just because of the way my mind works, I find it a lot easier to read analytic philosophy. I don't really struggle. There are some difficult analytic books, but like I can usually get it if I read it carefully. It's not that difficult for me to get. Whereas when I read continental philosophy, or at least when I try to, I'm just like, what is this? Why should I care about this? I don't get it. I'm not even sure what's being said. With analytic philosophy, like, I understand, I totally get why they're talking about the things they're talking about. I understand what they're saying. I can follow the arguments quite easily, and I have fun with it. Whereas with continental philosophy, I struggle to get it on any level, at least the things I've read. I also think there's probably differences in terms of topics and, in terms of the sorts of methodologies, more broadly speaking. So I would say that it's probably a real thing. Yeah, I think there's a distinction between these traditions. Okay, so BryanAFC, do you think there's any good evidence for the existence of intelligent alien life? Well, the best we can do is probably very indirect pointers. So the fact that we exist, our own existence, that's in a weak sense, that's evidence for the existence of others, right? It's so the fact that there is life on the planet Earth gives us reason to think that. Well, first of all, it shows that it can happen, right? We can show that life can emerge. So the fact that it has emerged shows that it can emerge, and so therefore we might well increase our credence that it has happened elsewhere. There are similar things as well, like the fact that life on Earth emerged, we think, very, very early in the development of Earth. So if you accept the standard scientific claims about the history of Earth and the history of life on Earth, then life emerged pretty much as soon as it was possible for it to do so. So, for the first, billion years or so of the Earth's existence, you just couldn't have had life, right? It's molten rock, right? There's no, well, certainly we couldn't have had life as we know it. It'd have to be a very unusual kind of life. But basically, like, as soon as the Earth sort of cooled down sufficiently and you had enough water and so on to sustain life as we know it, we get evidence that life emerged at that time. So the fact that life emerged so quickly, we might think, okay, well, that sort of shows that it's not difficult, at least cosmically speaking. The fact that life emerged so quickly here maybe suggests that it's relatively easy for it to happen. I mean, again, this is just an indirect sort of pointer, and anyway, even if life it may well be the case that life is very prevalent in the cosmos, but it just, for one reason or another, very, very rarely develops into what we would consider intelligent life. If I actually had to bet, and this isn't really based on much, but if I had to bet, I would bet that intelligent life is extremely rare. That would be my gun to the head sort of thing. If somebody, I would bet that we're the only intelligent civilization on the galaxy. So no, I don't think there's particularly good evidence for the existence of intelligent life beyond those more indirect things. If you're talking about there was the more there's the more like I don't know, fringe ideas, right? The more extreme claims that, well, maybe we've had like alien visitations here. I know that quite recently there was this big thing about the congressional investigations in the US into UFOs, or UAPs, I think they're calling them now. You had people like David Grush making claims that the military is covering up direct evidence of alien visitations. Now, I heard about this, and my initial reaction was, well, that's obviously just rubbish. Obviously, this is just, I shouldn't be giving this even a moment's consideration, and so I'm not going to. This is just, crazy people, as always, talking about UFOs. But then, I started to see people talk about this where I wasn't expecting those people to be taking it seriously. So I saw an interview with Sam Harris where he was saying, well, actually, this testimony about from people like David Grush and some of the the other people that have been making these claims. This is something we maybe need to take a bit more seriously. I also saw people talk about it on Less Wrong, and so here's the thing. Obviously, I have plenty of disagreements with Sam Harris. Obviously I have plenty of disagreements with the Less Wrong community. But there's different. I had this feeling that different people produce different kinds of bullshit. right? So, this the alien visitation stuff is not the sort of bullshit that I would have expected Sam Harris and Les Wrong to take seriously. It's like, look, if you talk to a Christian, say, you can expect them to buy into a certain kind of bullshit, and you wouldn't necessarily expect like a very traditional kind of Catholic Christian person to be taking something like I don't know, alchemy seriously. It's just that's not their thing, right? So it was similar here. It was like I wouldn't have expected, Sam Harris and Les Wrong and people like that to be taking the alien visitation stuff seriously. So then it made me think maybe there is something in this, right? Maybe the fact that this is not the sort of bullshit that I would have thought that they would be taking seriously. They are taking it seriously. So maybe I should check this out, because this is the sort of thing they should be very skeptical of. I would expect them to be skeptical of this sort of thing. There are plenty of kinds of bullshit that I expect them not to be skeptical of, but this particular kind of bullshit I expect them to be super skeptical of. So I thought, you know what, I will take it. I will look into it. I will, have a look at the claims being made here. Maybe it's different this time. So I did look into it, and it's the same crap as always. It's just total bullshit. I don't know what the hell. Okay, so basically, that's my reaction to the recent stuff about aliens. Was that it was the same crap as it always was. Here's the thing, right? What people would always say is like, well, this guy is like he's giving testimony under oath. He's a high-ranking military officer. If you look at the history of just complete bullshit claims about alien visitations, it always involves some high-ranking military officer, and there have previously been government investigations into this stuff. That's what it always is. It was in fact the same crap as always, and there's no reason to take it seriously at all. And I have no idea what the fuck was going on in the minds of the people who were taking it seriously. Anyway, that was my little story of how I wasted my time reading about just the most ridiculous claims about alien visitations, because I thought that I had a perhaps higher opinion than I should have done of Sam Harris and the Les Wrong community. Anyway, that was a bit of a ramble, and maybe not even to the point of your question. But okay, BubblePuppy says, what do you think of Martin Carrier's kind realism? So far it seems to be the best reconciliation between pessimistic meta-induction and the no miracle argument. And Carrier seems to provide that by requiring strong success, only being a realist about kinds. Yeah, I've read Carrier's work, but quite a long time ago. I didn't find it convincing at the time, and I've sort of forgotten anything that I would say about it specifically because it has been long enough ago and I don't have a very good memory. So what I can say though is this: the pessimistic induction is a terrible argument. The no miracle argument is a terrible argument. They are both terrible arguments. So the idea of creating a position that like reconciles these two arguments is, I think, that's just a mistake right from the start. We only need to have a position which like reconciles the pessimistic induction and the no miracle argument if we should be taking those arguments seriously. But as I said, no, I think they're very bad. In the case of the pessimistic induction, it just strikes me that there's a very plausible response, which is that like contemporary science is relevantly different from past science. So we can't inductively infer from the properties of past science anything about the properties of contemporary science, because there are just radical differences in terms of the sorts of methods that it uses, in terms of the just raw numbers of people doing it, in terms of its institutional structure, and so on. And that's, okay, so that's the sort of, let's say, more conventional response to the pessimistic induction. But then, moreover, I mean, my response would be I'm also just generally very skeptical of induction. So, even putting aside the problem that there are pretty radical differences between contemporary science and past science, I would be quite suspicious of the pessimistic induction. As for the no miracle argument, well, I mean, look, I don't buy the idea of there being this connection between success and truth. I don't think that the success of a theory justifies us in believing that it's true, and I've explained in detail in many videos my position there. So the carrier's position is poorly motivated. I also think that it's. I mean, okay, so I've again, made previous videos where I've directly defended anti-realism about kinds and classification. I'm not sure that kind realism really works on its own terms. I mean, so as you put it, the issue here is that, the thought is look, even if phlogiston theory is false, phlogiston is non-referential, it still successfully picks out true similarity relations between substance and processes. I don't know about this. I think that there are so many similarity relations, and the idea of similarity relations is so vague, and I think that what counts as a similarity relation is so much going to be dependent on what our goals are and how we are drawing boundaries, that I really don't see a lot of space for any robust form of realism here. But so that's my take on that. Okay, C asks, did your views about the aims, methods, subject matter and value of philosophy also change after becoming an anti-realist? If so, how much? I don't really remember anymore, but probably. It strikes me that one of the reasons why realism is so popular is that it enables certain philosophical projects that otherwise wouldn't really make much sense. I mean, if you take, for instance, questions about the metaphysics of time, right? Well, from an anti-realist point of view, like, what do you do there? You just say you don't know, right? Like the anti-realist is just going to say I don't know. Like when it comes to a lot of these metaphysical questions, they're going to say I don't know. And when it comes to questions about, they're going to say I don't know or there's no fact to the matter, right? Like one of those two. So what are the, like at time, A theory or B theory? I don't know, or there's no fact to the matter. Levels of selection in biology? I don't know, or there's no fact to the matter. If you want to have the sort of debate where you're like defending this position, you're saying like this is the way the world is, then that kind of presupposes a sort of realist approach. And I think that was probably the case for me as well. I mean, when I was younger, I'm sure I had opinions on some of these sorts of issues about the way the world is, and yeah, that would have required me to have presupposed realism. So I think the answer is yes, but I can't really remember anymore the extent to which that changed. So I'm just going to have to leave it there. Okay, second question. The history of philosophy is to a great extent that of a clash of certain human temperaments. That's a quote from James. At the end of reasons comes persuasion. That's a quote from Wittgenstein. Do you agree or at least sympathise with these statements, particularly with regard to the nature of philosophical disputes? I don't know. It's plausible that the positions that people take in philosophy are influenced by their temperament, by their personality. But I'm not really sure how strict that connection is. I think that you can find very different people, and there can be a lot of surprises. If you look at a philosophical debate and you try to think about, well, what sort of person might you expect to be defending one of these positions? So let's say, moral anti-realism versus moral realism. You might think that the moral anti-realist, maybe moral anti-realists are going to be more sort of wild, more bohemian, more libertarian, right? People who are moral realists are more conservative, more strict, more you can kind of do this sort of thing, but it just doesn't seem to me that there's that much of a correlation, at least among professional philosophers. So yeah, I don't know if I would agree with that. At least I don't know if I would agree with the James quote there. In fact, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with it. No, that's not my experience of philosophy. I think that what's happening is that we can sort of read into the work of other people like temperaments, but no, I think if we look at it in terms of is there really much of a correlation between personality and the philosophical positions a person holds? I'm extremely skeptical of that. I mean, there's going to be some. There's going to be some very weak correlation, but I don't think it's really. I don't think it tells us much. As for the idea that at the end of reasons comes persuasion, I don't know the context of this particular quote, so I'm not even sure what's being said here. Actually, I'd have to go and read what else was being said in order to have a good understanding of this. At the end of reasons comes persuasion, because I mean, what are we saying? That like the point of giving reasons is to persuade people? I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I often present my case for positions without any expectation that I'm going to persuade other people. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think of Feyerabend's democratic relativism as he characterizes it in Notes on Relativism? The argument that he gives there, I think there's a lot of problems with it. First of all, the argument that he actually gives there, like the justification, rests on this point that, well, traditions may profit from the study of other traditions. So by like opening ourselves up to these other traditions, that may improve our own tradition. Like even scientists should recognize that, okay, we can maybe improve science by engaging with these other traditions. But the thing is that's true. I mean, traditions may profit from engaging with other traditions, but equally traditions may profit from being dogmatic. And Feyerabend himself recognizes that point. I mean, that's the whole point about there being no universal method, no universal rule that's going to result in progress. So yeah, okay, traditions may benefit from engaging with other traditions. They may benefit from dogmatism as well, which I think at least undermines at least the part of the argument that he uses there, as I recall. Okay, so that's the point about the argument. I think that it's hard to see how to put into practice the sort of democratic relativism that he's talking about there. Like, when we think about schooling, for instance, I mean, there's two options, right? You could either say, well, like each tradition should just be in charge of schooling its own children, or you could say that every child should be taught every tradition. I mean, the second option is how would you can't do that. There's just too much, right? There's too many. How could schooling possibly teach everybody every tradition? So that's off the table, I think. The idea of having each tradition and each community have its own separate like education system. One of the things that worries me about this is that I think that there's a danger that you end up with not with a society that is multicultural and that has many competing traditions in it. What you end up with is just a sort of split society, right? Like you just end up with a bunch of communities that just kind of don't interact with each other and don't engage with each other, and then that no longer really seems to be capturing the point of what like democratic relativism is all about. So in other words, there's a danger of like segregation, basically. There's a danger, I think, that if we allow just every community to come up with its own education system, then what will probably happen is that the children in those communities just never engage with other communities. They never get exposed to other ideas, and then you just end up with a highly segregated society, which probably would have issues. And the other problem, I think, with the democratic relativism stuff is that, to a large extent, people, maybe this isn't really a problem, but I think people, want to defer to experts. I mean, if you think about like all of the technologies you use on a daily basis, in how many of those cases do you really understand anything about how the technology functions? Like, do you understand, how even something simple like a flushable toilet, right? Like how that functions? No, we don't understand that. So there's even with respect to like the stuff you have in your house, you kind of have to defer to experts when it comes to like how to structure society, and when it comes to the question of the sort of large scale technologies that are used in societies. It's really hard for me to see how to avoid deference to experts to some degree or another. I mean, again, maybe this isn't quite so much a problem because oh man, I really should have gone and this is a terrible answer. God, this is awful. My God, this is an awful answer. I should have read the book. I'm just, as I'm talking, I'm like, wait a minute, is this actually in conflict with what Feyerabend said there? Oh, dearie me. Okay. Oh my God. Should I keep this in the video? Or should I just stop and re-record it? I hate these videos. I hate them. I think I'm going to stop doing them. I hate the Ask Me Anythings. I do them because I want to engage with the community, right? But the problem is that I forget everything. And so when I do the Ask Me Anything, there's like two options. Either I spend like hours and hours and hours just like rereading stuff and doing research and writing notes, which I mean, I don't want to have to do. I don't want to have to do that. It's, I mean, the problem with it is that research is good when you're like researching one particular thing. So like when I can kind of sit down and just focus on something for a week, that's good. But when you do the Ask Me Anythings, you've got like 100 topics, and so I can't focus on any one of them. I can't sit down and do research on any particular one of them. It's just so I like. Well, I don't know even how it would be possible for me to. I mean, I guess it would be possible. It would just take like 2 months for me to release the video. So that leaves the option of just kind of talking off the top of my head. And then the problem is that I forget about stuff, and I don't formulate answers very well when I talk off the top of my head. So this is what we're seeing here. So the answer to the democratic relativism, did I even get it right? I mean, did what I say make any sense at all? I don't know. And that's why I hate these videos. I thought it would be okay this time because I did this thing where I was like, look, everybody, I'm not going to answer every question. So I was like, I'll just select the ones that I kind of know about and that I have a good sense of how to approach. And I looked at this question and I was like, oh yeah, Feyerabend's democratic relativism. I know I have some issues with it. I can also point out some of the things that I appreciate about it. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate about it is that I think there really genuinely is like, so first of all, Feyerabend is, I think, right that there's a conflict between our maybe sort of ordinary notion of democracy and then what we might call kind of epistocracy, right? Like a society that is led by experts. And it's not clear that we actually have we don't have like pure democracies. I mean, certainly just in terms of how the political system is set up, you couldn't have. I mean, it's not as though you could just ask the entire population to like vote on everything, right? You couldn't ask them to just vote on every policy the government has. No, you have to have some sort of representation. Like, you vote for a representative in Parliament or a representative in Congress, and then they make the decisions. So in that sense, democracies always involve shifting decisions away from the people to a kind of centralized power. At least all of the democracies that exist in practice. So there's that point, and then obviously it's the case that very often these people in power will defer to experts. Now the trouble is that deference to experts first of all, experts can easily be sort of, captured, right? There's capturing by industry. Secondly, experts can be completely mistaken, and it may well be that the experts are just using really terrible methodologies. I mean, if you look at something like nutrition science, I think it's very clear that a lot of the people who have been kind of designated as the experts of nutrition science are people who are maybe influenced by industry in problematic ways. And it's also the case that even when you look at the people who aren't, when you look at the sort of serious scientists who are trying to do good work, a lot of it's just really bad, like methodologically. We don't really have good data about what a healthy diet looks like. So I mean, I've talked about that in the video on dietary nihilism, right? I think, let me put it this way: there's a pretty good argument that we have very poor data about that. So that would, I think, be a point where like the kind of Feyerabendian democratic relativism has something useful to offer. Now, what I was doing was I was making a point about why I don't like doing these videos. Now I've gotten back onto the democratic relativism, and I feel like actually I could have probably given a reasonably good answer to the question. So, my God, this is awful. God. So, what's the conclusion here? There are some points I like about it, some points I don't like about it. What was even the question? What do you think of Feyerabend's democratic relativism? You know what? I think that at the end of the day, the trouble is this, right? The argument for this is going to... So, like, the idea of democratic relativism rests on this notion of, like, giving traditions sort of equal rights. I mean, that's probably not the right word. In some sense. We have to sort of allow science to flourish, but don't allow it to take over everything. So we have to, like, protect other traditions from science, but similarly protect science from other traditions. We need a kind of neutral framework that will allow the flourishing of these many traditions. Of course, the trouble is that any framework that does that is not going to be a neutral one. And I think Feyerabend is actually open about this, right? Like, liberal democracy is not a neutral framework. What's really going on is Feyerabend favours liberal democracy, and then he's seen this conflict between democracy and epistocracy, and so he's saying, well, like, I choose democracy, right? But it's not clear to me that that liberal democracy, as Feyerabend conceives of it, is actually all that valuable. I say, as Feyerabend conceives of it. And certainly I think many of the problems that we might, like, attribute to the development of technology and science could equally be said to be sort of problems for liberal democratic countries. And I guess from a more materialist point of view on this, social structure tends to follow technological development. So liberal democracies are like products of science. So anyway, I'm going to move on now. Okay then, do you see your anarchism as to some extent motivated by skepticism about categorical instrumental reasons? Well, I don't really identify as an anarchist, so I mean this is more just like a, it would be, I don't know, that's where my heart is in some sense, but I don't know anything about economics, so this is just a completely meaningless position. I mean, it's like I can't tell you like what society should actually be structured like, whether it could work, whether what the feasibility is. I have absolutely no idea because I've just never looked into any of the sort of empirical data that I would need in order to make a case for this. So I don't, I can say like I don't like governments. I don't like sort of hierarchical social control and all of that stuff, but. This isn't anything more than just a kind of nebulous feeling that I have. That's the extent of my anarchism. And bear in mind, I don't do anything for it, right? I'm not going to protests. I'm not involved in like mutual aid networks. I'm not actually doing anything. I'm not engaging in any sort of direct action, and I never will because I'm a coward. So I guess you can call me an anarchist if you want, but um, as to whether it's motivated by skepticism about categorical instrumental reasons, no. The skepticism about categorical instrumental reasons I would see as being a product of like meta-ethics or meta-normativity, and I do think there's a gap between the meta-ethical commitments and the sort of first-order normative commitments. If I'm an anarchist in any sense, then I would see that as more like a first-order normative commitment. One can be, a moral realist anarchist or a moral anti-realist anarchist or whatever else, I think. What is your view with regard to the ontological nature of rights in general? I just don't think that there are any. Carlos Rodriguez, what are your thoughts on the carnivore diet and hunting/fishing? So the carnivore diet seems to me a very silly idea. Maybe there are people who have very specific medical conditions that would mean that is a healthy option for them. But the idea that this is, this is going to be like of benefit, that this is like the healthy diet for human beings in general, I think is deeply implausible. First of all, because I think that diet claims in general are deeply implausible. I think that when it comes to any claim about such and such is the healthy diet, then you should have a relatively low credence in that, or at least I have a relatively low credence in that, just right off the bat, right? Regardless of what the evidence is, regardless of what the arguments are, when I look at the history of claims about diets, it's just a history of failure, right? A graveyard of failed theories, to quote Loudon in from a different context. So there's that, and there's also just the fact that, look, when I look at human beings as a species, we seem to be sort of generalists. It seems like we're able to adapt very easily to very different diets. There's some species where they have to eat very specific things. They're adapted to a very specific diet. That doesn't seem to be the case for humans. So you can look at different societies, and you can find like healthy societies, healthy people eating very different diets. So if we think about, the main issue for us obviously is like the diseases of civilization. It's obesity, cancer, heart disease. Now, you can find plenty of societies with relatively low rates of these problems where they consume a great deal of like plant-based foods, where they're eating stuff other than meat. In fact, there's not really many societies at all that eat only meat. The closest, I think, is the Inuit, right? They have a very, very high meat diet, but with the Inuit, they also have very specific genetic adaptations that makes that like possible for them. And I believe that even with those, they still have relatively high rates of cardiovascular disease compared to a lot of other like small scale societies. So just looking at that sort of evidence, it seems to me like, well, it doesn't seem like a good idea. Okay, so that's my thoughts on the carnivore diet. With respect to hunting and fishing, I don't really object to it in principle. So these days my take on sort of animals is I would really prefer to just leave them alone. But there are situations where, we just, there are maybe other sorts of, so like, because animals might be introduced into areas where they end up damaging the environment in general, it's not really clear to me that there's anything, well, I don't tend to think that there's much problematic about, using hunting as a means of population control or something like that. And in any case, it's just really hard to sort of feel mad about hunting and fishing when I think about the treatment of animals on like factory farms or whatever. It's just even if it is a problem, it's like so there's like this other problem that's so much bigger and so much more horrifying. Like if you care about animal welfare at all, then it just seems like an odd place to focus. But anyway, that's my thought on that. Okay, commutative division ring. If you could choose your gender identity, sexual orientation, and personality such that you basically retroactively decide how you'd have been born as, what would those be? Well, I would like to have been born bisexual. I'm straight, and I kind of wish I was bisexual, just because it would have been, from a practical point of view, more useful if I was attracted to both genders. Right, that would have given me more options. It turns out that it's really difficult to attract women, at least for me. Women in general don't seem to be that interested in me, and I don't care enough to bother putting in the effort to try to make them interested. Like I'm just the way I am. You know, you can take it or leave it. And as it happens, most women want to leave it, and I'm like, okay, whatever, fine. But it would have been nice if basically it would have just been nice if I was able to attract more people. I have noticed that although there's not so many women interested in me, there's a lot of men who are, right? There's loads of, I think there's been far more men who have propositioned me than women. And I have no doubt there would have been far more men receptive to my propositioning them. So, yeah, bisexuality would have been nice, I guess. I would have done that. As for my personality, obviously I would have removed the fairly extreme anxiety that I sometimes experience, but beyond that, I think I'd remain basically the same. Dominik S, do you agree that the arguments Kripke gives against descriptivism about proper names are incredibly overrated? Well, not really. I don't myself agree with those arguments. I have problems with those arguments, but are they incredibly overrated? I mean, I think that Kripke made interesting points that moved the conversation forward, so that's fine, right? And it makes sense to me that we're still talking about him when we present the historical development of these ideas. So I guess in that sense, I wouldn't say that they're overrated. I mean, to say a little bit about my own take on this. Okay, so we've got like the like modal argument about rigid designation. So the idea is supposed to be that ordinary proper names are rigid designators. Descriptions are not rigid designators, so ordinary proper names are not descriptions. I actually think that it's not so clear to me that ordinary proper names are rigid designators. So okay, the name designates the same object in all possible worlds. But to me, something like, let's take Venus is the morning star. Okay, in the actual world, Venus is the morning star. We made an empirical discovery that these refer to the same thing, but I think, yeah, it might have been the case that Venus was not the morning star. It might have been the case that these were different things. So in this world, Venus is the morning star. In another world with a different history, they designate different objects. So certainly there's no sort of, if the name refers to the same object in all possible worlds, then, there should be, like, the identity relation should hold, and it should be that, like, okay, Venus is the morning star in all possible worlds. So yeah, because Venus and the morning star in this world designate the same object. So if proper names designate the same object in every possible world, then they would designate the same object in every possible world. But I don't actually buy that. I think it's very easy to come up with worlds in which they end up designating different objects. I suppose, though, the general point is that the modal profile of proper names and descriptions differs, which I guess seems fair enough. So then there's what is it? The sort of semantic argument, which would be something like, there are cases where I just don't associate any particular descriptive content with a name, or the descriptive content that I associate with the name is mistaken. Maybe so maybe I don't have any idea who Karlheinz Stockhausen is, or maybe I believe that Stockhausen was the writer of 433, and that's all I believe about Stockhausen. But we still want to say that supposedly that in these cases, well, intuitively, you know, when I use the name Stockhausen, I'm referring to that unique individual that is Karlheinz Stockhausen. You know, I'm not picking out the writer of 433. Now, in this case, though, I mean, I think there's like two things I would say about this. First of all, I think a descriptivist can very easily account for this by appealing to the idea of like offloading cognitive labor onto others. So, you know, I can like the meaning of the name is a sort of cluster of descriptions. Say it's just that the cluster of descriptions are descriptions that are believed by certain relevant other people. You know, the relevant experts or whatever. There's enough other people in the society who have the understanding of who Stockhausen was, and you know, I'm just sort of inheriting the name from them. So it's, I mean, I guess that's more of a mixed theory, but still, you know, you get I think that really is. That's more to me in the spirit of descriptivism, it seems. But more importantly, I just don't really see what's problematic about concluding that I actually do just fail to refer to Stockhausen in those cases. So, like, there's this assumption that in our ordinary language, we do in fact pretty much all of the time successfully refer to the individuals that, you know, we might seem to be successfully referring to. I don't see any reason to accept that. Like, if I'm talking to somebody and they say the word Stockhausen and they believe that Stockhausen is the writer of 433, I think it's completely reasonable to say that actually they've failed to refer to Stockhausen. That's not what. Actually, they just mean the writer of 433. They've ended up referring to John Cage. Now, of course, because I know the distinction between Stockhausen and Cage. When I hear them use the word Stockhausen, you know, that makes me think of a particular person, and so I end up successfully kind of picking out the right you know, I end up successfully picking out Stockhausen when I listen to what they're saying. But why suppose that individual is successfully referring to Stockhausen? I don't know. And I'm inclined to be sympathetic to the idea that reference might fail maybe more often than some of these philosophers are assuming, and that the alternative way to look at it would be to say, well, it sort of just doesn't really matter if reference fails. It doesn't matter if my terms fail to refer, provided I'm using the terms in like the right way, you know, in such a way that other people can. Because like, just think about this intuitively, right? Like, let's say I think that Stockhausen is the writer of 433, and that's all I think about him. I know a little bit about what 433 was, and you know, I've associated the name Stockhausen with that. And then somebody gives me a book on experimental music, and I read about Stockhausen and John Cage. I mean, I might just say to myself, you know, I was referring to, you know, a different person. Like, I had a different person in mind. You know, I don't know where I got this name Stockhausen from, but you know, clearly I mixed it up, and so when I was saying Stockhausen, I just, you know, I ended up actually referring to the person whose name was John Cage. That seems totally intuitive to me. So yeah, there you go. There's some of my thoughts on Kripke's arguments with regard to proper names. Either Spark 7874. In your opinion, who's the most annoyingly incorrect philosophy and why? Most annoyingly incorrect philosophy and why? I don't like Wittgenstein and some of the people who were influenced by Wittgenstein, particularly the ordinary language philosophers. There's a lot of people who were influenced by Wittgenstein who've done fantastic work. So you know, don't get me wrong there, but that sort of movement of ordinary language philosophy and what it took from Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, I find it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, is it annoying? It kind of is a bit annoying, actually. I think that there's so many things about it that bother me. I mean, so first of all, what you tend to find in this tradition is, you know, okay, so the basic idea of ordinary language philosophy is that, like, you know, philosophical problems arise from misuses of language. And in particular, ordinary language philosophers tend to object to the idea that there's some sort of, you know, that like there's a meaning to our sentences that is, like a proposition that is expressed by our sentences, regardless of context. So, the way that philosophers have often approached language is to think that sentences express propositions, and then we can state the propositions that are expressed by a sentence. We can like work out what proposition is expressed by a sentence, and then we can look at the logical relationships between propositions, and this will be like the source and solution of philosophical problems. Now that kind of approach is, I think, problematic. I think the ordinary language philosophers are right to object to it. But on their view, they're going to say something like meaning is not some sort of like abstract object that you can isolate independently of context. It's not like it's not like we can just say like this is the proposition expressed by a sentence. The meaning of a sentence is a matter more of like the role that it plays in our languages and our social behavior more broadly. And then there's this key claim that ordinary language is already perfectly well suited to its purposes and to the needs that it services, and it does not need any reform, right? Philosophical problems arise when people kind of misuse language. And now, the trouble I have with this is what you end up getting are lots of pronouncements about the rules of use, about what constitutes the appropriate use of terms or a misuse of terms. And very often these pronouncements are accompanied by zero empirical data. There's just, and this is something that I think needs, it's like if you're telling me that like, well, this is like the ordinary usage or the rule of use, I want to see some empirical data that shows that that's actually how the term is used. And ordinary language philosophers don't bother doing that. What they do is they just sort of sit on their armchairs and think about stuff in the same way that every other philosopher does. But then they end up making claims about, they end up making what seem to me to be claims about essentially like linguistics. And so if you want to make those sorts of claims, then, okay, you better go and get some data. I also think there's never been a good case made as to why ordinary language is like suited to its purposes in the sense that it's perfectly like coherent. So I don't think there's a good case to be. I don't think there's ever been a good case made as to why ordinary language shouldn't turn out to involve incoherent commitments. I also think that questions about ordinary language are kind of irrelevant anyway, because philosophy is a technical subject, and we can introduce technical distinctions in the course of these sorts of inquiries, distinctions which just have no role in other contexts. But the main reason why I dislike it, the main reason why I find it annoying, is because it is viciously conservative in its orientation. It is totally unimaginative. It is, what you end up with is a picture where like essentially like common sense is reigns supreme, right? Challenges to it can't even be conceived. Ordinary usage is, you just sort of defer to ordinary usage. It's almost obsequious. And so that bothers me a lot. That's why I find it annoying. So there you go. What do you think of the new atheists? Probably they had, I think probably socially and politically they were quite valuable. I mean, especially in the context of places like the American South, for instance. I'm very glad that the new atheists were around and that they sort of quite aggressively put atheism on the table. And I do understand that, from the point of view of like, well, the society in which I'm in, there is something a little bit, when you listen to like the more strident of the new atheists, it can come across as a little bit cringy. It's like, okay, I mean, who cares? Like, does it really matter? Not. But the thing is that no, there are plenty of places in the world where, there are plenty of places that are highly religious, and where, these religious communities are, like they're very exclusionary. Like if you're an atheist, you're going to be ostracized, and where the religion has significant influences on the sort of moral values, and it even has a lot of political power. And in that context, I think, yeah, it's good that there's people who are very aggressively attacking that. I think that's a good thing. Now, when it comes to the sort of quality of philosophical argument, I'm less impressed, but I don't really think that's the point. I mean, again, it's more of a sort of social political movement than one that's based on, kind of just sitting down, giving careful arguments. So yeah, there's a big difference between the goal, I think, of somebody like, say, BryanAFC versus Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens. I think that for Dawkins and Hitchens there is a social and political aim, whereas for someone like BryanAFC it's just, no, I'm just interested in working through these arguments in a somewhat detached way. It's both fine, but I do think there's a value to the new atheist stuff. You ask, what is the most convincing argument for the existence of God? Well, yeah, I think this is one of these questions. A lot of people have asked me this, and I just, the honest answer is I just don't think there is one. I've never seen an argument for the existence of God that struck me as even remotely convincing, and I can kind of get myself into a place where I can imagine being convinced by an argument if I were to completely transform my epistemic commitments. So I guess if I was to become a more sort of bog standard naturalist, say, it's like scientific realist naturalist, then I guess I could get myself into a place where the fine-tuning argument would be would maybe have some hope of moving me a little bit of the way towards the existence of God. Maybe even with the fine-tuning argument, it's tricky because I feel like there are so many other plausible explanations for why you might find fine-tuning. The multiverse, I think, is a perfectly acceptable explanation. Or maybe the universe was created, but it was just not created by a god. Maybe this is a simulation. Okay, so we have, the simulation hypothesis is something that seems to me to be a perfectly serious hypothesis. I think that's one that there's no compelling case against it, at least, and I think there might even be some reasons to take it seriously as a positive proposal about the underlying metaphysics of the world, and that would account for fine-tuning. So, I mean, God is just one among various explanations, but the key point is if you accept inference to the best explanation is a guide to truth, and you buy into scientific realism and all of that stuff, then I guess you can at least see how, well, by postulating God, we now have an explanation of this otherwise rather strange phenomena, and maybe we can also show that the God explanation is more virtuous in some sense than these other explanations. But this is there's a chasm between where I am right now and the sort of epistemology that would lead me to take that seriously. So I don't think there are any convincing arguments for God. Elijah Dick asks, as a scientific anti-realist, do you think that the mistake realists are making is inferring real entities from scientific descriptions, or do you think that the way we formulate scientific descriptions is fundamentally flawed? This is so I'm not entirely sure what you mean when you say the way we formulate scientific descriptions is fundamentally flawed. What I can say is I take it the motivation for most anti-realists is going to be epistemic, right? So the inference okay, what we have are theories that are remarkably successful, right? They are remarkably powerful tools for systematizing, predicting, and controlling the phenomena, the observable phenomena. And then now the question is, right, do we have grounds for making the inference that the things postulated by these theories actually exist? And the anti-realist is going to say no, right? The anti-realist is going to be skeptical of that move, of the inference from what is postulated by the theories to what exists. And I mean, that is my position, right? I deny inference to the best explanation. I deny the sorts of arguments that are used to infer from the success of theories to their truth. But now, okay, so that's one point. That's the first thing, right? So yes, realists do make a mistake in inferring real entities from scientific descriptions, because they take it that there's certain features of those scientific descriptions, say those scientific descriptions play an indispensable role in our best theories, in successful theories, and then they want to infer from that to the truth or to the reality of the entities postulated by those descriptions. I reject that inference. So now let's come to this idea that the formulation of scientific descriptions is itself fundamentally flawed. I mean, I guess one way to take this would be that scientific language fails to express propositions or something like that. And I'm not really very sympathetic to that. I think that there's nothing. I don't see any problem attributing literal meaning to scientific sentences, or at least there's no greater problem with attributing meaning to scientific sentences than there is to sentences in any other context. I mean, meaning is meaning is a tricky thing in general. I tend to have a rather Quinean sort of attitude to meaning, meaning and reference in general. But I don't think there's any special problem in the context of science with meaning. I mean, one other way we could think of this is there's a point that's made by Kuhn, which is that the truth value of any statement is going to be dependent on the language, the lexicon that is used to formulate the statement, right? The truth value of a statement depends on the concepts that are used in that statement. So if truth is a matter of correspondence, then there must be some sense in which there's like a lexicon of the world, right? So it's like the world must have a sort of conceptual structure to it. So when I say something like grass is green, okay, I'm like dividing this. There's this thing, grass, which is divided from other things, and then there's greenness divided from other colours. And then the thought was, well, if that's true, that must consist in there somehow being in the world itself this division between, you know, like grass and greenness. They must exist as natural kinds. The language carves nature at its joints. And that, I think, is very questionable. But I don't know whether I would say that. I mean, that's not to say that the description itself is flawed, right? It's just that, well, I would prefer to put it by just saying that, you know, that there are no natural kinds or something like that. And that doesn't mean that language is flawed. Language might be a perfectly, you know, useful and a useful tool. Okay, you also ask, would anything about our scientific tools change if most scientists accepted your views? Well, with respect to scientific realism versus anti-realism, no, I don't think it makes much difference. And most anti-realists are perfectly happy to grant that, yeah, science is a very successful endeavor, and we're not objecting to the methodologies that scientists use. What we're objecting to is the kind of philosophical interpretation that's being brought to science. Now, obviously, you know, so there are going to be more specific debates where actually we might object to the methodologies. And so, I mean, I have done it. You know, I mean, I made a video on dietary nihilism where I looked at diet science and I argued that, you know, well, I mean, I didn't argue it exactly, but I presented some reasons for taking seriously the idea that actually the methodologies here are highly flawed, and you know, that a lot of this science is untrustworthy, even from regardless of whether we're talking about, you know, realism versus anti-realism. It's just like these results are not reliable, and people have made similar arguments about other fields of science. But that, I think, is somewhat tangential to the realism anti-realism debate. The realism anti-realism debate, what you need to do is, like, imagine that you have. So here's the thing: when you look at the, say, criticisms that somebody might have of diet science, there's methodological problems, okay? But what we need to be doing when we're talking about realism anti-realism is, like, imagine a case of science where it didn't have those methodological problems. So you consider the ideal case, as it were. You consider a case of where the science is proceeding as we want it to proceed. Well, in that case, are we justified? Would we be justified in taking these theories to be true, or would they merely be useful instruments? And I would go with the useful instrument interpretation. Éric B asks, why are all the big proofs so trivial? For example, all proofs for or against the existence of God don't actually help justify real-world religious actions, while all those for or against the existence of free will can't really help us make better political and economic decisions. I think this is just a feature of philosophy. Philosophy doesn't generally deal with practical issues. I mean, sometimes it does. There are areas of philosophy where, you know, we sort of tackle, you know, get our hands dirty and tackle practical problems. But a lot of the central questions in philosophy are, you know, they're just separate from, they're just dealing with different things. It's not clear, like, why we would expect I mean, I don't agree with you that it's trivial. These questions are interesting, so it's perfectly fine to engage with them. When somebody asks about, well, does God exist? I think that's an interesting question in itself, regardless of whether we then end up concluding anything about how we ought to live our lives right now. I mean, I think that you could, in principle, like come up with an argument for the existence of God that does lead to particular real world actions. You would just need to, if you came up with an argument for the existence of a Christian God, if you came up with an argument to the effect that the Bible is true, well, that might tell us something about how we ought to live right now. But you're right that no, most of these arguments for God are just for the existence of, the God of the philosophers, the being that is omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, creator of the universe. And just believing that doesn't tell me anything about how I should act. But that's I don't see that as a problem. I guess I would just say that if that is a problem, then maybe philosophy isn't really for you. Maybe it's just not your thing. Again, that's not entirely fair because look, there are we have applied ethics, and then within philosophy of science, there are plenty of philosophers who are sort of dealing with questions that are of relevance to like practicing scientists. If you look at, say, in philosophy of biology, right, like there's work by philosophers on things like the species problem and how that relates to biodiversity assessments and things like that. But when it comes to the, as you put it, the big proofs, the big questions, I think the big philosophical questions are basically impractical questions. Ethan asks, favourite Kubrick film and why? Well, this one is a pretty easy answer because my favourite film in general, not just from Kubrick, my favourite film in general is 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's been my favourite film for a very, very long time. Why is this? I mean, part of it is just that it has a very important place in my life, I think. I remember the first time I watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. And I saw it on it was like a rubbish VHS copy on a fairly small television, which is not really the best circumstances in which to watch 2001: A Space Odyssey. But even under those circumstances, I was just absolutely transfixed. I mean, I'd never seen anything like this. I remember when you think about, like, okay, let's say a film wants to show, the development of technology, right? The development of mankind, right? What's it going to do? Well, it's probably going to show like some sort of montage, right? That cuts between, you sort of skip ahead hundreds of thousands, you show clips each 100,000 years or something like that. You show the gradual the process of developing technology. What did Kubrick do? Well, we watched 2001: A Space Odyssey, and you just start out with like 15 minutes of a bunch of apes, and they can't talk. There's no like dialogue. There's no language. It's literally just a bunch of apes, and it just goes on and on. And you just sit with them for ages. And I mean, remember, I'm watching this as a kid, right? Like I'm 10 years old, and I'm just sitting with these apes. And then there's that scene where the ape figures out how to use a bone to bash somebody's brains in, and then it throws the bone in the air, and then you see the bone go up, and bang! Satellite. It was just breathtaking. I mean, I'm like, I've never seen anything like this. And then that reaction of I've never seen anything like this continued throughout the whole film. It was just unique, and it led to me, so it left a really deep impression on me, and it led to me looking for other films like it. And for a lot of my teenage years, I spent my time watching what actually were just the most rubbish art house movies, because I was sort of looking for something like 2001, but I never found anything that gave me the same feeling. So 2001, it really stunned me. It was unlike anything I saw, and it left a deep impression. So it has, because I saw it when I was young, I think it will always have that kind of nostalgic feeling for me. It will always be important to me. So that's one reason why it's my favourite. But anyway, I mean, more generally, I think obviously the film is just visually stunning. I think the use of music is incredible. I think like just the sound design in general. There's the bits where it's like it shows things in space, and you have like the white noise that like shh, and it just goes like shh, and it just goes on. I love that stuff. It also, in terms of its narrative, like it strikes the perfect balance between. It has a sort of traditionally structured narrative form, but it's also got a lot of ambiguity, such that you kind of, I mean, what's going on is that as you're watching it, you sort of don't know. There's many points where you don't know what's going on, but each step feels right. And I love that. There's a real kind of tension to that. There's not many films that really do that. Another one is David Lynch's Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. That does it as well. It's like this point, you kind of like don't know what's happening, but whatever it is that's happening feels right. It slots it into a structure that produces the right emotions. So there's that. I also think that it's emotionally incredibly moving. People say that Kubrick is a very cold director, and I have no idea what they're talking about. I don't know what the hell they're watching. It doesn't seem like it could be the same thing that I was watching. Look at the scene of the deactivation of Hal. I think if I had to choose one scene that's my favourite, it would probably be that one. I mean, obviously there's the ending with the light show. That's amazing. But I think my favourite scene in there is the deactivation of Hal, because it's extremely minimal. Like the result, like at this point, right, we're just on a spacecraft, one person and a computer, and the computer is pleading for its life. And what we see is, when Dave goes into the sort of innards of Hal, we see it. We're with him every step of the way. He takes the key, puts it in the slot, turns, and then the thing comes out, and we're with him on every single one. And that's all we're seeing. We're just seeing it's just a guy putting a key into a slot, turning it, putting a key into a slot, turning it. That's all it is. And it's an incredibly ambivalent scene, because on the one hand, I think there's a great tension here, right? We kind of know that nothing is going to happen today, but it's like by the time he's in there and he's turning the keys, he's basically safe at that point. But even so, there's this. Because I think it's because at this point, he's at Jupiter. He's completely alone. Like once Hal is gone, he's completely alone. He's completely alone. So it's incredibly tense, because you sort of have that feeling that no, something can still go wrong here. Something could still go wrong for him. And even if nothing goes wrong, where does he end up? He ends up totally alone, stranded by Jupiter, basically. My God, that's intense. And at the same time, you've got Hal, and it's really like, it's really upsetting when Hal is pleading for his life. I think part of it is that the voice, because it's completely monotone, there's this weird thing where like it can't express emotions. So it's like there's this pleading, this desperation for this fear of death, and it's trying to like persuade Dave to stop, but it's not able to express it, and it's such a strange and unnerving. It just doesn't. Something feels wrong about it, and so it's like both sad and also kind of unnerving. I love, and then all of these emotions are going on in this extremely minimal scene. So anyway, that's 2001: A Space Odyssey, and that's why I love it. Okay. Felipe Camargo, any thoughts about what Newcomb's paradox shows us in terms of the difference between causation and correlation? I don't think Newcomb's paradox itself really shows as much about this, but the views that we have about the nature of causality obviously are going to affect what we say about the Newcomb's paradox case. I mean, there is a danger here, because the way that Newcomb's paradox is just set up, like the way that it's sort of stipulated, is, well, we just have to be considering a case where where like what you do when you enter the room you no longer have any causal influence on what's in the boxes. It's possible to just stipulate. I mean, if you're just stipulating the case in that way, then fair enough. The thing is that for me, I'm not sure that I would see that as like I'm not sure I accept the stipulation, right? Because my line on this, I'm a causal anti-realist. I think that we like project causality. I think causality is like a projection of our, like, we have this feeling of an ability to manipulate things, and then, you know, it's like I can twiddle the knobs over here, and then I see something happening over here, and then if you know, I can sort of twiddle the knobs in a particular way and get particular patterns, right? And then from that ability, I can then sort of project that onto other things. So if you have that sort of anti-realist projectivist view of causality, there's nothing in principle problematic about causing things to have happened in the past. So I go into the room, I take one box, and I cause it to have been the case that the predictor predicted that I would one box, and therefore I cause the predictor to have put the million in there. Now, in saying that, so what that means is that if you accept that approach to causality, then evidential decision theory and causal decision theory end up saying the same thing in the Newcomb's paradox case, which is that you should one box. But the thing is that the whole point of Newcomb's paradox is to get us a case where evidential decision theory and causal decision theory say something different. Like, that's the reason why we're presenting this. So it's maybe sort of missing the point of it to respond in that way. But I mean, ultimately, if you want my assessment of the paradox, I can only, you know, like, if you want my honest assessment, well, I got to assess it in terms of the views I actually have. And from the causal anti-realist point of view, I have to say, well, I just don't accept the claim that the person who enters the room can no longer cause the million to be placed in the box. I actually think you do cause that. And I think if we lived in a world in which Newcomb's paradox type cases were very common, then, you know, if it was just like an everyday feature of our experience that we faced these sorts of cases, I think it would be perfectly natural to say, yeah, we cause something to have happened in the past. Like, my actions now cause something to have been the case in the past. Like, I bring it about that it was the case that the predictor did such and such. So, I mean, again, though, this isn't something that Newcomb's paradox itself shows. There's no, you know, just from having Newcomb's like, just from the case of Newcomb's paradox, that doesn't sort of commit you to any. That doesn't in itself show you anything about the way causality works. It's just that the answer we give in a Newcomb's paradox type scenario is, I think, going to be dependent on our views of causality. Okay, Femboy Origami asks, thoughts on moral subjectivism or relativism? I mean, that's sort of, I guess I'm sympathetic to these sorts of moral anti-realisms, but I don't know if I I don't know if I have a sort of quick summary position here. I mean, ultimately, I think there are technical issues with these sorts of views. If moral subjectivism or relativism is being made as a claim about, you know, the meaning of moral statements, well, I tend to think that there just is no universal account of what the meaning of moral statements is. So I don't know. Obviously, I'm very sympathetic to moral anti-realism, but it looks like I don't have many thoughts. You'd think that I would have thoughts, wouldn't you? Given that, like, metaethics is, you know, one of the main things that I've been talking about over the many years of this channel. So you'd think that I would have thoughts on this, but it looks like my mind is coming up blank. So there's two options, really. Option number one is I sit here and try to think of something, which could take a while. Option number two is I just move on, and I'm just going to move on. So, favourite 60s albums. Yeah, I'd have to have written down my favourite 60s albums. I can't think off the top of my head. What albums were made in the 60s? I must have. I do have favourite 60s albums. What albums were made in the 60s? Why am I not thinking of anything? I don't. Oh God, this is all falling apart again. Sun Ra, the heliocentric worlds of Sun Ra, Sun Ra, the Magic City. Um, what have we got here? Cecil Taylor, Unit Structures. The Doors, of course, yeah, The Doors, their self-titled album. That was the first album that I ever... The first piece of music that I ever really liked was The End by The Doors. When I watched... I was 13 years old. I watched the film Apocalypse Now, and The End by The Doors came on, and something clicked in my head, and I was like, oh yes, I like this a lot. That was the first piece of music I liked. I didn't like music when I was a kid, but then I heard The Doors, so I got into that. That's one of them. Of course, Beefheart, Trout Mask Replica, obviously. What have we got here? Velvet Underground, White Light, White Heat, Albert Ayler, Love Cry, Tiny Tim. God bless Tiny Tim. That's another one. Yeah. Zappa's Lumpy Gravy. Yeah, obviously Zappa was in the 60s, wasn't he? These are some of the albums from the 60s that I like. Alan Silver, Lunar Surface, was that 60s? Or was that in the 70s? Alan Silver definitely released something in the 60s, so we'll go with that one too. White Noises and Electric Storm. That was a band that involved Delia Derbyshire, who was most well known for her work in creating the soundtrack to Doctor Who, the theme to Doctor Who, and she produced some of the other music that was used in classic Doctor Who as well. I suspect that my music tastes these days have been very heavily influenced by the sound design on some of those old Doctor Who albums. Sonny Sharrock's Black Woman. Okay, so there you go. Those are some of my favourite albums from the 60s. Thoughts on non-binary and xenogenders, people who consider themselves neither solely male nor female, and perhaps use some random label like frog gender or star gender to describe themselves. So, with respect to the non-binary thing, I mean, I don't. So, it is possible that under some interpretations of what it is to have a gender, that I am non-binary. So here's what I would understand a sort of standard line to be. The standard line would be something like, well, so there's a distinction between sex and gender, right? And the gender is going to be fixed by gender identity, where gender identity is supposed to be some sort of, psychological profile, right? There's something about your psychology, because obviously somebody can have, so there's a few things going on, right? There's the sex, then there's the gender presentation, the way you appear socially, the way you would be classed by others, and then there's gender identity. And I think that on at least a standard view, the gender identity is what's really fixing your gender. It might well be the case that maybe just for practical reasons or whatever, you're not able to express your gender identity. It might be that somebody has a feminine gender identity, like somebody would feel like I am a woman, but maybe they're just living in a society in which it would there would be severe negative consequences if they lived that way, so they can't. But still, it's like, no, the gender identity is what would like make them have the woman gender of woman, right? On that sort of view, it seems to me, as best I can tell, I just don't have a gender identity. So in that sense, I would end up being non-binary. As for the xenogender thing, I think that one of the issue I have with something like this is that it seems to involve a fairly sort of radical linguistic change. So when I think about like let's say the more standard trans people or indeed non-binary people, there's not really any linguistic change required, right? Like so, if somebody says I'm a woman, then you just say, okay, well, you know, she, her, right? We already have a linguistic convention of using she, her pronouns. So you just sort of count, now you just use those pronouns for that person. Or if somebody says they're non-binary, well, we already have, you know, non-binary pronouns in English. There's they, them, right? So you can kind of just adopt the language that's already in place. And it's not, I don't think it's really like imposing anything on anybody else, you know, to just say, well, you know, use different pronouns, right? Use she, her, use he, him. I don't have to do any kind of like work, right, as it were, like mental work, to kind of reorganize my language if somebody says, okay, I'm a woman or I'm a man, or indeed I'm non-binary, can you use they, them. But when it comes to the xenogenders, it seems like that, at least if that's also going to be accompanied by neopronouns, then that does seem to me to be a little more involved. Now, I mean, I don't know, is that an objection? Well, I'm just very skeptical about attempts to... I'm skeptical of the possibility of success of attempts to... let's say, construct language. I don't think that really works. You know, sometimes we introduce new terms and new ideas, and sometimes they take off, but you know, very often they don't, and it's hard to sort of subject it to sort of rational control, to sort of say, well, you know, it would be good for language to work this way, so it should work this way, especially when we're dealing with I mean, it's one thing to sort of introduce a new term, to introduce a new distinction, but like when we're talking about pronouns, that's something that's a bit more, I don't know, grammatically deeper, in a sense. So I am very doubtful that there will be much of a role for neopronouns, but I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong. So I guess that, I mean, look, I don't really know anything about xenogenders, and I have no issue with it. I mean, it's fine, right? People. You know, yeah, it's great. I'm very much in favour of just people doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things with gender, because I think it's good to, you know, break down gender norms. And it seems to me that if we're just proliferating a whole load of these xenogenders, then I guess that's one way to do that. But as I said, I mean, I'm just doubtful about the possibility of these sorts of significant linguistic changes taking off. And I think that the xenogender thing seems to involve a much more significant linguistic change than you know, somebody, say, transitioning from man to woman, because we just already have woman and she, her, and things like that. Okay, Gabriel Rixon says, I recall you saying in a previous AMA that you find process philosophy a dead end. Do you still hold this view? If so, why or why not? I know you fancy John Dupre's work. Okay, so I should just say my view on this hasn't changed from the previous AMA, and my reasons haven't changed, so whatever the reasons I gave there, they haven't changed. I haven't done anything more on process philosophy. With respect to John Dupre, I really admire John Dupre's earlier work. I think The Disorder of Things is a fantastic book. But yeah, I think the process philosophy stuff, I cannot, for the life of me, understand the motivation for it. It just feels like, it just feels like, you know, using a sort of slightly different language to describe, you know, it's like we take the sort of same phenomena, the same metaphysical commitments, and we just use a slightly different language to describe them. That's what John Dupre's process philosophy seems to me to amount to. So like, yeah, we can describe what's going on in terms of things, or we can describe what's going on in terms of processes. I mean, those it really seems like a verbal dispute of the most pointless kind to me. Now, when you look at the history of process philosophy, obviously somebody like Whitehead, he had like a pretty substantial metaphysical commitments, right? This wasn't just a mere re-description of things. But when I look at that sort of process philosophy, I just think there's no reason to take it seriously. With respect to someone like Dupre, his approach to process philosophy, it's just like he's choosing to use language in a different way or something. I don't see. I mean, I don't really have a substantive disagreement with it, because it seems to me there's nothing substantive to disagree with. So that's my take on that. Gottfried Leibniz, as a scientific/epistemological anti-realist, how do you deal with evidence standards in judicial systems? Can we ever justly morally convict anyone? If yes, would you still get rid of standards with clear conflict with anti-realism, e.g. fingerprint tracers, DNA tracers? I don't agree that fingerprint tracers and DNA tracers do have a clear conflict with anti-realism, at least not the sort of standard kind of anti-realism. So the standard line for anti-realists would be to say something like, scientific theories are very powerful tools for systematizing, predicting, and controlling the observable phenomena. And so, we can use theories to sort of get at the facts about what's happened in the observable world. And when it comes to judicial systems, that's what matters. It doesn't really. So, okay, with respect to DNA, right? It doesn't really matter whether there actually is DNA. The point is we have some tool which allows us to reliably identify who has committed the murder. And as long as we have a tool that allows us to reliably identify who has committed the murder, that's enough. It doesn't matter whether we believe that. So we also have like a model of how this tool works. We have a story about how the tool works. And we don't have to get on board. It doesn't matter whether we think that this model is giving us a correct description of the reality behind the phenomena, or whether the model is, it's just a sort of useful instrument for helping us think about how to use the tool. So, I don't think there's a conflict with anti-realism here. In any case, I mean, honestly, I probably have a higher. I probably want higher standards with respect to these things anyway. So although in principle there isn't necessarily an issue with using things like DNA tracers, in practice those aren't as secure as some people take them to be. And I really wish I could elaborate on this, but I can't, because I simply don't remember at this point the sort of science behind all of this. But if you look this up and you do research on this, I think you will find that there are reasons to be very cautious about the use of things like DNA evidence. So I think the way that we often think about this is the way that it's sort of presented in a court will be, well, we have like a DNA match between this and the suspect, and it's like a 99.999% chance against it being anyone else or whatever. But those sorts of claims are, well, it can be misleading. And again, you would have to go and look this up, but there are reasons to be a bit more skeptical of just how reliable these sorts of sources of evidence actually are. Anyway, I'll just say that, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the realism, anti-realism thing. Okay, lol, 010101. What do you think about agency in philosophy of biology? The idea that agency can make sense of functions and purposes in biology. For example, the purpose of the heart is to pump blood and not to make thumping noises from the perspective of the organism because of the organism's goals, affordances, and repertoire. I think that's more plausible, and nothing is better or worse from the perspective of the organism. So it's perfectly fine to define a function with respect to a given perspective. I mean, we can look at function, so we can look at systems in the world and think about like what those systems are doing, and then you know, we can break those systems down into parts, and we can ask, okay, how do the different parts of this system contribute to the ability of that system to do that thing? I mean, this is basically the way that we would approach functions from a causal role point of view, right? And I don't think there's any objection to that. And certainly, you know, when we look at organisms, I mean, yeah, like definitely one of the things that's really important is like the organism's continued existence. Like, okay, how does the organism continue to exist? How does the organism do, or like, how does the organism hunt for food? These are things that matter to us when we study organisms, and I suppose in some sense they're things that matter to the organism itself. The organism has, I guess, you know, like if it's an animal, right? An animal, a deer, has some drive to run away from a predator, and so yeah, I mean, we can take that perspective. That's a very useful perspective to take, but I don't think that that gives you objective functions. I don't think it gives you objective purposes. This is, it seems to me, just another kind of application of the sort of causal role point of view. Um, at least that's one way to look at it. I mean, what you would have to argue, I suppose, is that the is that the so first of all, you'd have to show that there's some objective matter about what the point of view of the agency of the organism actually is. So, like the organism's goals, affordances, and repertoire, right? So there's something that fixes what those are, and then we'd have to show that that is what objectively. That's the sort of that's the capacity that objectively determines what the function is, that determines the distinction between function and effect. And that's where I think, going to, you know, I mean, I don't see that there's any good case for thinking that there's anything like metaphysically special about any of these things. There are various capacities, right? There are various things organisms do, and we can then, you know, ask how the different parts of the organism contribute to that. Fine. And within some context of investigation, we would then distinguish the function and the effect in that kind of way. But I don't see why there's like some objective function or objective purpose beyond that. Okay, Holden. In a video a while back, you noted that you found Bob Dylan's self-portrait to be a masterpiece. I do find the hate for that record to be overblown, but I'm curious, what about the album for you makes it rise to that level? Yeah, I think self-portrait is it's I think it's this sort of sprawling kind of very evocative like journey. You know, I feel like Dylan is sort of taking me on a journey through, you know, the American prairies or something. It's, you know, because you've kind of got it's very folksy. It's like got a bit of a country inflection, and there's a lot of covers on there of more traditional songs. And then it's the way the music is played is I think it's like really good. I think the playing is excellent, but it's much more loose, right? It's played in a kind, you know, it sort of feel like you're you know, the band has like just kind of gotten together, like, and they, you know, they're just kind of playing like outside a bit, you know, so it's got that like loose, unstructured feel. It's exploratory. You know, it really just transports me to like a particular place in a particular time, in a way that really very few albums do. Like it's the mood of the album is really quite unique, and I mean, you know, again, it's like the songs are all brilliant. You know, I mean, I think they're really like quite catchy. You know, and there's some quite like clever things going on musically, but it's yeah, it's that like sprawling kind of loose but still very talented. And that's a hard thing to do, I think, is to like get that is to have that is to sort of have something that is like both clearly, I think, played in a talented way, but also like captures that more sort of wild and bohemian spirit. And man, self-portrait, I just think it nails it. So yeah, I guess that's why I love it so much. Maybe that tells you a little bit about the way I see it. Okay. um, Okay, Irving IV asks, which fruits have you eaten before? Well, I eat a lot of fruit. I would not be able to give you a list of all the fruits I've eaten, certainly not off the top of my head, because there's so many. But basically, just look at whatever fruits are relatively easily available in the United Kingdom. Um, I've tried them. I've tried them all, and some other ones that aren't so easily available. So yeah, which fruits are you eager to try? Well, I suppose the main one would be guava. I don't think I've ever had guava, but guava. Well, I mean, it's a fruit. I'm curious about all fruits, but this one in particular is there's the Ween album, Pure Guava, which is a great album. So guava is a fruit which like it has a whole album named after it. Moreover, I feel like I should have tried it before because I've been to Mexico and they have guava in that part of the world. So why didn't I try it? It just didn't occur to me at the time, but that's one that's on my list. Another one I'm curious about is durian fruit because durian is supposed to be one of the most foul-smelling foods in the world, and I am, my interest is piqued by that. I mean, it might be awful, but it's sometimes interesting to experience these bizarre and terrible foods. So I'd like to know what durian fruit's all about. I'd like to know how bad it smells and whether I would be able to enjoy eating it. Okay. Which fruit do you enjoy most on its own? That is a tricky question. Because it kind of depends on, why I'm eating the fruit. I mean, am I eating it like if it's in the middle of the day and I'm feeling hungry and I need energy, then something like a banana is obviously really good. If it's for a dessert after a meal, then it'd be a bit different. Maybe something like raspberries or blackberries. I also really love pears, and I really love persimmons. So maybe and avocados, but avocados aren't really so much like I don't know. They don't feel like fruits, do they? Avocados. You wouldn't put an avocado in a fruit salad, but even it is a fruit, and I'll just eat a straight up avocado on its own. Um, so yeah, those are good. I mean, I feel like yeah, it depends on the context, I suppose. But yeah, which fruit do you enjoy most as part of another food? I'm very lazy when it comes to creating meals. So I tend to just eat stuff as I find it. I'll when I make a meal, I'll just get some. I might get like I don't know some potatoes, boil them up, put some vegetables with them, or I might I don't know get some beans. Just eat beans from a can or something. I don't. I'm really lazy. I don't like make stuff. I don't make meals. I'm sure I have eaten things that have fruits as part of it, but I don't know. What would you? I mean, what do you even use fruits in? I suppose there's some. I feel like there's some like quite sweet tasting Indian foods, Indian curries that probably have fruits in them. Oh no, actually, the obvious one here would be something like, an avocado toast. Like if you have toast, avocado, crack an egg on it, that's delicious. And that's something I have a lot. So probably that. Italo Zazen says, okay, so we have a quote from a Chinese philosopher whose name I probably shouldn't try to pronounce, but let's say Tung Chung Shu, claimed regular and irregular natural events contain symbolic politico-cosmic meaning. And you ask, if a particle physicist who observes strange regular and irregular generations of particles and then claimed this theory, would that place them as a crank, or would the scientist in question salvage themselves through taking a cogent philosophical stance? I actually think that if a scientist was to defend a physical theory that was unorthodox, I think they would make themselves much worse off in the eyes of other scientists by then trying to appeal to some philosophical justification for that theory. Like that would make them appear to be even more of a crank. It seems to me that the sorts of standards that prevail in contemporary science are such that it's very insular, right? Like when you put forward a scientific theory, you have to defend it in scientific terms. You can't defend it by appealing to philosophical considerations or any other consideration, right? You don't make a philosophical argument for a particular scientific theory. Now, I mean, there are exceptions to this. I've seen, I suppose when it comes to things like the, interpretations of quantum mechanics or something like that, you can get philosophical arguments or things that are more like philosophical arguments for specific, for say, the many worlds interpretation. Fair enough, but I mean, the point is that we're using philosophical arguments there to decide between sort of theories that are all within the current scientific norm. Now, if somebody was to come and try to defend a highly unorthodox theory, just in virtue of it being a highly unorthodox theory, that's already going to kind of put them outside the standard scientific community. And if they were to then sort of frame it in terms of following from a particular philosophical stance, that's going to push them even further outside the scientific community. So I think it seems to me the standards within the scientific community are very strict about what sorts of reasons you can appeal to when defending a theory. And philosophy doesn't really count. Johnny Boy New asks, is there any time or place in history that you wish you could live in? Well, not really. I suppose maybe I would go back a couple of decades. I think we've had a pretty damn good run in the West, at least in the United Kingdom. We've had a pretty good run these last few decades. Obviously, there's plenty of problems, but I think it's better now than it's going to be in the future. Things are not looking good. I suspect that things are probably going to get worse gradually over the next few decades. So I wouldn't mind going back a bit. But the thing is, I don't want to go back too far because, look, the thing, like, I'm a product of, modern technological society, right? I like the sorts of creature comforts that technology affords. I'm used to it. I also have very, liberal, progressive sorts of values. I don't want to live in a world where there's a lot of homophobia, where there's strict gender roles and things like that. So, I mean, I guess I could maybe go back to maybe the 60s and 70s and then just live out my life. Although, no, maybe even that's too far back because I want the internet. I like that. I like that's been such a part of my life. I don't want to lose it. But then I don't know if I went back to sort of the 60s and 70s, it might be like easier to get maybe a career in academia. It's hard to say, but certainly I wouldn't be going back to a period before we had like hot water or before we had, running hot water that comes out of a tap or before we had antibiotics or anything like that. Jordan Crago. What are some reasons to think contractarianism of the Hobbes Epicurus variety is a more plausible moral theory than utilitarianism and deontology? I feel like if I was engaged in this sort of arguments in favour of particular normative ethical frameworks, if I was to engage in that, which I don't really, I suppose the thing about the Hobbesian contractarianism is it maybe gives a more compelling response to people who would otherwise just sort of reject morality. I mean, there's like, I suppose that the thing is with like utilitarianism and deontology is somebody can always just say, yeah, well, I don't care about that, right? And I mean, you can say that about anything. Okay, so maybe I should put it this way. If somebody is just completely self-interested, then, how do you then get them on board? How do you sort of persuade them to start like valuing the welfare of other people, or to start, so how do you get them on board with your moral framework? And I do feel that with utilitarianism and deontology, there comes a point where you just end up hitting a wall, and it's just like, okay, you either have you either think other people matter and you care about them, or you don't. Like the sociopath, there's not really much we can say to them. Maybe, but at least with the contractarian approach, at least the Hobbesian sort of line that you would take on it would be something like, well, look, the reason why. So we're gonna come up with a bunch of rules such that if everybody follows these rules, it makes everybody better off. So the reason why you follow these rules is just for that reason, like it makes so you're better off if we all follow these rules. Now, of course, you could be a free rider, right? But like, if you're a free rider, maybe that will encourage other people to be free riders. So, and of course, if you're a free rider, then maybe we're going to punish you. So like, we don't really even need to appeal to anything other than just your long-term self-interest. It's like, if you care about your own welfare, then hey, you should follow the rule that you don't go around murdering people you dislike. Why? Because you don't want to be murdered by people who dislike you. And so we all kind of make an agreement and we say, okay, we're not going to murder each other. And we all agree to follow that. And we all agree to punish the people who refuse to follow that. So I feel like the Hobbesian approach can maybe like give a response to that sort of selfish sociopath who would otherwise be unmoved. The Hobbesian can provide them with some sort of self-interested reason for following these rules in a way that is maybe less open to the utilitarian or deontologist. So I guess that's one factor. Of course, you might always come across a sociopath who just says that they also don't particularly care about their own welfare, right? I mean, maybe they're not moved by considerations of prudential reason either. In which case, good luck. So it's not perfect. But again, if I feel like that's probably to me the sort of thing that's more appealing about contractarianism over these other sorts of approaches. At least contractarianism of the Hobbesian variety. Hobbes was, I don't necessarily want to attribute this to Hobbes, but the feeling that I get when I look at the sort of Hobbesian contractarians is that they sort of want to start from fairly minimal positions, in the sense that we're not having to suppose that there really are moral facts out there that we might be right or wrong about, right? We can just start with the claim that, okay, there are people, people end up in conflicts, people have different interests, and if people all, as a group agree to abide by particular rules, then good. And if people stop abiding by those rules, then at least on the Hobbesian framework, okay, you don't have to follow the rules anymore. In fact, I think Hobbes even says that, like, even if you're like living in a society and you break the laws and the Leviathan decides to execute you, there's no longer any it's perfectly fine for you to just do everything you can to run away. And you no longer have any reason to continue following the laws, right? Like at that point, you're essentially back in the sort of state of nature, and there's no obligation on you to do anything, which of course is a little bit different from that. Like something like the Kantian line would be, well, if somebody commits a crime, then it's actually like good to punish them. It's respecting their autonomy and their decision to violate the moral. Like, they've made the autonomous decision to violate the rules, and now they are worthy of punishment. Like that sort of line. Hobbes doesn't go in for any of that. He's like, yeah, if the government's gonna execute you, even if you've broken the laws, then that's it. Run away. Do whatever you can to save yourself. So anyway. Obviously, I think all of these theories are just, I don't find any of them appealing, let's put it that way. But that's what I would say. Okay. Julian asks, what is your meta-ontology? What do ontological statements or questions mean? Are there framework universe of discourse-independent ontological facts? I mean, I'm basically a sort of global constructivist. So the answer would be no. There are no, in my view, there are no framework independent ontological facts. I think that what there is relative to the framework, relative to our classification schemes, relative to our perspectives. That's where I am. Is the analytic synthetic distinction dead? I think that is the analytic synthetic distinction dead? Does the answer to this question change if we distinguish between formal and natural languages? I think that the analytic-synthetic distinction is one of those things that's quite plausibly a sort of useful. Okay, it's a useful distinction. I mean, the boundaries may well be vague, and I mean, look, I generally have a sort of Quinean view of meaning. I think actually Quine's arguments against analyticity are quite poor, because his argument sort of involves saying, well, here's one way we can define analyticity, it doesn't work. Here's another way we can define analyticity, it doesn't work. Here's another way we can think about analyticity, it doesn't work. So, he kind of goes through this thing where he's like, well, we can think of analyticity in terms of necessity, that doesn't work. We think of it in terms of synonymy, that doesn't work, right? So he sort of shows these different approaches to analyticity and shows that they don't work. Now, the problem with that type of argument against anything is, well, that's the case, I think, for all of our concepts, right? I mean, just in general, it's very hard to come up with a definition of any concept. So you're going to find the same sort of pattern if you try to define knowledge. And you can just look at the history of epistemology. You can find tons of different definitions of knowledge, and none of them quite work, right? And similarly, even something like chair, right? You're going to find a similar thing. What happens when you look at... So in the case of analyticity, what we find is none of these definitions are quite adequate. Moreover, we end up with a sort of circle of interdefined terms. So it might be that, you define analyticity in terms of necessity, define necessity in terms of synonymy, define synonymy in terms of intersubstitutability in different sentences, and then you end up defining intersubstitutability in terms of analyticity. Again, I don't think that that's necessarily an issue. I suspect that many of our concepts work that way. It's perfectly... as long as you have like a sophisticated web of concepts, and as long as though that sophisticated web is tied to some sort of theory, or it's applied in some particular way, I think that's actually enough. That's enough for it to be meaningful. So with that said, I'm not so sympathetic to the Quinean attack on analyticity specifically, but I have, just for other reasons, I'm in favour of the view that meaning is indeterminate. And so, strictly speaking, there is no analyticity. The analytic-synthetic distinction goes away. But that's strictly speaking, right? I mean, there are all sorts of useful idealizations where, strictly speaking, we would say that it's false, but we don't always want to speak strictly. So I can say, for instance, that the Earth is, 48,000 kilometers in circumference or something, and that's false, strictly speaking. Strictly speaking, in fact, any number that you give, strictly speaking, is going to be false, or at least idealized. But that's fine, it's sort of true enough. So I think when we think about language, right, there is a perfectly sensible distinction between a case where we have a sentence which is true in virtue of, the way the world is, right? Like, grass is green. Okay, well, grass is green, and it didn't have to be green. It could have been some other colour. In fact, very often it is some other colour. Maybe grass is green isn't really even true, right? Is it green at night? I mean, maybe not. Is it green when the grass dies? But anyway, something like grass is green, true in virtue of the way the world is, versus grass is grass. Okay, that's just true just because of the form of the sentence. The distinction may not be a strict one, but it still seems like there are contexts where it's useful to draw that distinction. And certainly I think there are contexts where it's useful to just say, well, we're going to take, these claims, we're going to take this set of claims as sort of rules of the language that we're using. And I mean, I suppose this is your point about, like, does the answer to this question change if we distinguish formal and natural languages? Of course I can just stipulate a formal language where I'm just saying, like, by stipulation, these terms mean the same thing, right? That's just like the rule of the game that I'm stipulating here, is these terms have the same meaning. I don't, like, nothing can stop me from doing that. Of course I can do that. So yes. that's my view on that. What's your opinion of logical pluralism? So my approach to I think I am a kind of logical pluralist. My approach to formal logic would be something like this. I don't think that there is a one true logic. So the way that I think many philosophers tend to approach this is they think that what's going on is, well, we can state, for instance, arguments, and then there's a fact of the matter about the propositions that are expressed by each premise of those arguments, and there's a fact of the matter about the logical form of those propositions, and then there's a fact of the matter about whether the logical form is truth preserving. So, you know, we begin with an argument, right? We figure out which propositions are expressed, and then we figure out like whether those propositions have a truth preserving form. And I think this gets things completely wrong. I think that logic is that like formal logical systems are essentially like tools that we have constructed, which we can apply to help us to assess and evaluate arguments. But it's not the case that there's, you know, some fact of the, like there's some fact about what's. So first of all, there's not any fact of the matter about what the logical form of any given argument actually is. So, for instance, let's say I say Cain is a philosopher, therefore there exist philosophers. So if we look at that in terms of like if we look at it in terms of propositional logic, then what you have is just P therefore Q, and that's not valid. That's an invalid form. On the other hand, if you look at that in terms of, you know, quantified propositional logic, then okay, we can now begin to see a more a finer grained structure here. We can start to say, you know, there is an x, like so we have basically px, therefore there exists an x such that px. Sorry, not px. We have like pa, therefore there exists an x such that px. That would be the logical form if we use quantified propositional logic, predicate logic, to do this. So, like, is there some fact of the matter what the logical form of that argument really is? I don't think so. No, so, you know, in one of these cases we end up with a valid argument, in another case we don't, and I don't think there's any fact of the matter, right, which, like, what form it really has. What's happening is we've got a tool which has allowed us to sort of draw out more or less fine-grained structure from the argument. And the other thing is that even if you, once you settle on what the logical form is, there's then a question about whether the inference preserves truth. So I choose this case because if you look at this from the point of view of classical predicate logic, then what you're going to say is that the argument is valid. It does indeed preserve truth. So PA, therefore there exists an X such that PX is valid in classical predicate logic. But if you're like a Meinongian or something, and maybe you adopt some sort of free logic, then that inference fails to hold, because you can't infer from, you can't infer from PA, like some object A has property P. You can't infer from that to there exists an X such that X has property P. Okay, which of those is truth preserving? Well, that's going to depend on how we decide to understand the way that the sort of domain of discourse works, and the way that we choose to interpret things, in my view, and the way that we choose to carve things up. Now, it may well be that one of these systems is, simpler or more useful or more fruitful. So we can reasonably argue that, look, classical predicate logic is just a much more elegant system. So that's why we favour it. But I see that as just a kind of practical decision, right? Like, there's nothing. I don't think there's anything incorrect about taking it that there are, so, okay, well, actually we can quantify over non-existent objects, and so we can say, PA does not entail there exists an X such that PX. And so I suppose what I've said there should also answer the final question you ask, which is what's my opinion of Carnap? And my opinion of Carnap is pretty positive, I suppose, at least with respect to, you know, I guess his position on ontology. I think that I'm probably a bit more... I mean, Carnap, in some sense, sort of tries to avoid, you know, making genuine commitments here. I think what Carnap wants to say is that, you know, we can't really even express the... So what I would say is, like, I'm a constructivist. I'm a fictionalist about this sort of stuff. I'd be happy to say, like, yeah, we make it up. Whereas Carnap, I think, would be more inclined towards saying that the very... You know, you can't really even express the position of constructivism. But I don't know. I feel like in spirit, I like a lot of what he says, at least in the, you know, empiricism, semantics, ontology stuff. Julio Hernandez, do you agree with Graham Priest that nothing is an inconsistent object because it is simultaneously an object because it can be talked about in the absence of all objects? Does this make nothingness special? Okay, I should just say I've literally just answered a question, which, I mean, so basically, I think that this stuff, there's just no fact to the matter, and it's just a matter of how we choose to carve things up and how we choose to use language. And I've literally just answered a question from somebody called Julian, in which I explain a little bit about where my perspective is coming from there. So you can go and check that out, right? Yeah. Because I basically take the same line on whether or not nothingness is an object. That's just going to be a matter of the way that we decide to carve up the space of objects. Okay, according to you, any concept can be construed as self-contradictory, such as a white vulture being both a vulture and not a vulture. Are you a relativist about what nothingness is? I'm a little bit unsure what the connection is between those 2 points. Oh, the self-contradictory thing was in reference to the thing about Graham Priest saying nothingness is... yeah. This is a little bit different because, you know, what I think what I'm saying is anything can be a contradiction. So what I'm saying is that contradiction is essentially a property of our languages, not a property of things in the world. No matter what way the world is, we can choose a consistent language to describe it, or we can choose an inconsistent language to describe it. That's the point that I'm getting at. So just like anything can be a contradictory object. Now, what Graham Priest wants to say is that no, there is like this. He's making a claim about metaphysics, where he's saying like no, the thing in the world, right? There is this, you know, thing out there, and this has contradictory properties. And you know, if we describe this in a way that's consistent, we would be making a mistake. Similarly, when it comes to most of the items of everyday experience, like, you know, computers or vultures or, you know, trees or flowers or whatever, I think Priest's position would be like these are consistent, and you'd be making a mistake if you take them to be, you know, realizing contradictory properties. Whereas, so for him, you know, contradiction is like a property of the world out there. We can be right or wrong about it. Whereas for me, it's like whether or not these things are contradictory is just a matter of the way that we choose to describe them. For any, you know, for any sort of contradictory object, you can come up with a consistent language that refers to it. You know, I mean, if you, I mean, I'm in the case of nothingness, I suppose the answer is, well, you know, we have a word like nothingness. There's no, in that word in itself, of course you can elaborate on particular meanings of that word so that it's, you know, both an object and an absence of all objects. But in order to talk about nothingness in that kind of way, that requires you to have some sort of theory of like objecthood. If you just don't get on board with abstracting from, like, for instance, we might just refuse to kind of abstract from just descriptions of particular things or descriptions of absences of things to talk of like objects in general. So one of the things that's happening here is we're abstracting from our descriptions of stuff to descriptions of objects and parthood relations and things like that. We don't have to get on board with that. So, so that's yeah. So we don't have to describe it in contradictory terms, and so yeah. I think I would be coming at this from a very different perspective than someone like Priest. But am I a relativist about what nothingness is? Yes, because I'm just basically a relativist about everything. So, so I'm a relativist about that. Okay then, Kane B's bet. If there is no meaning, is there truth? I came across this question by thinking about whether truth is fixed by meaning. Does the truth of grass is green depend on what I mean by grass, green, etc.? Well, yeah, I think that the truth of a proposition is going to be dependent on the meaning, the meaning of the concepts invoked, and then the way things are. The truth of a sentence is dependent on the meaning of the words and the way the world is. So, like you say, when I say grass is green, the truth of that depends on what we mean by the word green. It's kind of hard to see how, on any standard theory of truth, you're going to get away from that. I mean, you know, like if the word green, it's just arbitrary, right? We arbitrarily use it to refer to this particular color, but there easily could be a language where green is switched with something else. There could be a language where green ends up referring to the color black, and where black refers to the color green. In that case, if we say grass is green, we would count that as false. So I think that truth is pretty closely connected to meaning, yeah. And actually, one of the reasons why I have such a sort of indeterminate view of truth. I mean, I sort of explained this in the video that I did. It's called "There Is No Such Thing as Truth," but that's not really what I'm. That was a bit of a clickbait title. But look, I'm an indeterminist about meaning, so I end up thinking that, yeah, truth is indeterminate as well for that reason. You say, related, if truth is relative to persons but there are no persons, is there truth / are some things true? Well, the idea is that truth is going to be relative to perspective, but I intentionally use the word perspective rather than persons. I mean, perspective can so the idea of a perspective is that it's sort of a set of, it's a set of things like particular standards, goals, values, particular classification schemes. Now, when I explain my position, obviously I'll say things like, well, we have certain standards, we classify things in certain ways, we draw certain lines, and that is something where you think, well, that's obviously something that's being done by persons, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be done by persons. I mean, in principle, you don't need persons at all. In fact, you don't need minds at all. You don't have to divide up the world in such a way that you end up with like persons or minds or anything like that. So truth is relative to perspective, but no, I don't think it is relative to persons. Of course, if truth is relative to persons and there are no persons, then of course there would be no truths. I'd agree, yeah, that seems fine, but I would just say I think it's a mistake to characterize relativism in terms of claiming that the truth is relative to persons specifically. Because you just, yeah, I mean, I don't need, you don't need persons. It seems like, one thing that you could, so here's another sort of framework that one could adopt is just to say that there's just okay, imagine this, imagine that there's just nothing but the sort of immediate appearances, okay, and then nothing more. So there's just this is a sort of combination of like solipsism plus a kind of Humean view of the self, right? So basically what there is there's perceptions, there's like visual images, there's sounds, colors, tastes, and so on. And then there's like a stream of what we would normally call like the mental parts, right? There's thoughts, and there's emotions, and there's visual images, imaginations, right? But none of this is unified into any person, and and there's not even like any sort of distinction being drawn between, okay, there's stuff out there and stuff in here. Basically, there's just, like imagine like a list, right? Like color, sound, taste, smell, uh, memory, emotion, imagination. Traditionally, of course, we kind of put the colors and the sounds and the tastes and smells as being like, okay, these are things that are like representing a world out there. They're the perceptual thing, and then these other things are the internal states. But but you don't have to do that, right? So from that sort of perspective, you wouldn't necessarily have to have persons, but I think you could still state truths about things. Okay, do you have a favourite kind of sound, like crickets or the slight white noise you get in your ears when it's really quiet, pencil on paper? No, I don't. I love sound in general, and I don't actually have a favourite one. I don't like the fact that I've given this answer, because when people ask a question like, what's your favourite X? Even when you don't have a favourite X, it's fun to just give one, right? To just name one. And I want to be able to do that, but I just can't. Like I'm when it comes to sounds, I love basically all sounds as long as they're not physically painful. Sound is just one of my favourite things in general, and wherever I am, I can just immediately stop and appreciate whatever sound I'm hearing, whether it's a sound of traffic, whether it's a sound of a refrigerator drone, whether it's a sound of rain pattering on the window, or the sound of people walking around in a shop, or the sound of birds singing outside, or the sound of the ocean. I love it. I love sound. One of the things I do like, actually, here's what I would say, maybe, is, and I've loved this ever since I was a kid. I love it when you get sort of decay and disorder interfering with order. So one of the things I love is, like, when we used to have analog radios, if you drove into a valley, the signal would be interrupted. So you'd have like a song playing, and then the song would fade into white noise and kind of come back, and you'd hear the song, and then the white noise would get louder, and then it would get a bit quieter, then it would get louder again, and sometimes it would fade out completely. And I just found that fascinating. It just really, I don't know, it made me think of like radio towers and radio transmissions, and I don't know, it just had this real evocative feeling in it. So I loved that as a kid, and I still love that now. So maybe I would say that's kind of one of my favorite things that happens with sounds, is that like combination of hearing something very carefully created, something very well structured, and then it's almost like what's happening is that the medium is making itself known. So in the case of a radio, right, like the point is you forget that you're listening to you don't realize it's a radio. It's almost kind of like an illusion going on, that you just have the music. Now the music is being carried by radio transmissions, obviously, but you don't think about that. There's just the music. You forget the medium and you just hear the content. But one of the things I love is when the medium begins to interfere with the content. It's almost like the canvas of the painting seeps through the painting itself. Something about that is very appealing indeed. So yeah, there you go. There's one of my favourites. Okay. Crusader. What do you think is the strongest argument for scientific realism, and how do you respond to it as a scientific anti-realist? The strongest argument. Yeah. I want to pick something interesting. I want to give an interesting answer. But but the actual answer that isn't interesting. So what I mean is that, like, okay, there's the obvious answer, which is, well, it would have to be some sort of appeal to inference the best explanation, and then combine that with, you know, something like an appeal to, you know, the remarkable success of science in some sense, right? So, you know, like the best explanation for the fact that science produces like novel predictions and so on is that the theories in question are like getting things right in some sense. That sort of argument is the standard argument for scientific realism. And I think actually, you know, there's many arguments for scientific realism which try to be different, and it turns out if you look at them carefully, they're not really all that different at all. Like Ian Hacking, he tried to give an argument for realism which was separate from the inference to the best explanation on the basis of success, but I don't think that it really was. Like, at least under many plausible interpretations of how Hacking's argument works, it ends up being just another kind of inference to the best explanation. So, you know, the question is, so I don't want to cite that one as like the strongest, just because it's, I don't know, it's kind of boring. Like, that's the one everybody would cite. But it's hard to get away from the fact that, like, what's really driving realism, like what's really motivating it, is the thought that, well, you know, surely you couldn't have something, it couldn't be this successful, right? You couldn't have something which does as well as these theories do if they weren't getting things right in some sense. Like, if you ask yourself, well, why do we believe that there are electrons, whereas we don't believe in things like, you know, the Homeric gods? And surely the answer's got something to do with the fact that these theories that postulate electrons do so well. You know, they're such remarkably powerful theories. So I think it would probably have to be that. But I don't know. That feels like a boring answer. I'm sorry, but maybe sometimes you get boring answers. Okay, I think that is the answer. I think that's what the strongest argument is. And how do I respond to it as a scientific anti-realist? Can I just direct you to the videos I've done where I've like responded? Because here's the thing, like, I could give you a response here, but like it wouldn't be anywhere near as good as what I've already said at length in many other videos. I have a video called why I'm not a scientific realist, where I respond to that argument at length. I have a video called classification and kinds, an anti-realist view. I have a video on my scientific realism series called idealization. All of these raise challenges to this type of argument. So I would just direct you to that. I'm not going to try to do a better summary here. But I'm still sort of like, is there a more sort of, is there a better one? Is there a more clever one? There are other arguments for realism, but they're in my opinion, they're really bad. So I certainly wouldn't say that. So for instance, there's one idea is that so there's a guy called I shouldn't necessarily say these arguments are really bad, but I don't know. I don't want to say anything now because I just this is okay. So this response video is not going well, and this is now the third time that I've had to. I'm never doing this again. Oh Christ, man, I can't stand this. Okay. Oh. I'm keeping all this in, you know. I'm not editing any of this out. This video is a disaster, and I'm gonna put it up. I'm gonna upload it as it is, in the disastrous form that it has taken. And this will be the final one. This is the last Ask Me Anything I'm ever doing. I absolutely hate this. I don't know why I do it. Well, I do know why I do it. It's because it's a way of engaging with the community, you know. But I'm not good at it, and I don't particularly. Let's just say I'm very much a loner. I'm not good at engaging with the community. I think it's time for me to just be honest about that. I'm never going to be somebody who's particularly good at community engagement. Anyway, this question, do I want to continue saying what I was going to say about that? This was a question that was totally reasonable because it's about, you know, things that I've made videos about. You know, I mean, this has been my area of expertise for literally, well, probably over a decade or something now. I mean, this is the main thing that I've been focusing on for all that time. And yet, look at this. Look at the absolute hash. I'm just completely bungling it. I mean, it's almost at the point where I could get away with saying that this is some sort of like avant-garde performance art, right? So maybe that's what's really going on here. And that would be in line with my character, right? You've seen things like the red dot videos. Maybe this is just another red dot video. Okay. I'm going to have to stop now anyway for a little bit. And maybe I'll just upload this video as it is, and then I can sort of do another part tomorrow. Or maybe I won't do the other part. Okay, we're gonna stop here. I didn't really answer the question properly, did I? Maybe I should come back to that. So, what do you think is the... Here's the problem. There are other arguments for scientific realism, but I'm not confident in my ability to explain... I should be able to explain them, right? But maybe I'll get them wrong. And I don't really want to say something that I then think is incorrect. I wouldn't want to have to go back and, you know... how is it possible that my memory is this poor?